I want to begin with an idea that I think most people get fundamentally wrong about periods of economic upheaval. And getting it wrong is not a harmless error because it shapes how they respond to the upheaval, and how they respond determines which side of it they end up on. The idea is this: when people imagine a great economic disruption, a crisis, a transition, a period of turmoil in the financial order, they imagine that wealth is destroyed. They picture it vanishing, evaporating, ceasing to exist, as though the turmoil were a fire that simply consumes value and leaves less of it in the world. And this picture, this intuition of destruction, is almost entirely wrong, and its wrongness is precisely what makes it dangerous. Let me be careful about the extremes here, because this is a subject where people reach immediately for one of two false pictures. The first is the picture of doom, the picture I just described, in which upheaval simply destroys wealth and everyone is poorer, and the whole thing is a catastrophe to be feared and survived. And the second is the opposite picture, the optimistic one, in which economic transitions are simply engines of growth that lift everyone, in which the rising tide raises all boats, and the disruption is a universal good. Both of these are false, and both are false in the same way, because both of them miss the actual structure of what happens during a major economic transition, which is neither destruction nor universal elevation, but something far more consequential and far more overlooked. What actually happens during a major transition is a transfer. Wealth does not disappear. It moves. It moves from one set of hands to another, from those positioned to lose it to those positioned to receive it, and the transition is precisely the mechanism by which that transfer occurs. The great disruptions of economic history are not primarily events in which wealth is created or destroyed. They are events in which wealth changes ownership on an enormous scale, and the people who understand this and who position themselves to be on the receiving side of the transfer rather than the supplying side come out of the transition holding what the transition moved. I want to develop this principle carefully because it is the foundation of everything else I want to say, and it is worth stating with some precision. Wealth in a transition behaves in a way that is closer to conservation than to destruction. When an asset loses its value, that value did not vanish into nothing. Someone was on the other side of that decline. When one person sold at the top and another bought and then watched it fall, the wealth transferred from the buyer to the seller. When a currency erodes and the savings held in it lose their purchasing power, that purchasing power did not evaporate. It flowed to those who held the assets whose prices rose, and to the debtors whose real obligations shrank. When a company collapses and its former competitors absorb its market and its customers and its talent, the value was not destroyed, it was transferred to the survivors. In transition after transition, the language of destruction, the language of wealth being wiped out and lost and evaporated, conceals a transfer, and the concealment is not incidental. The concealment is part of the mechanism, because the people on the losing side of a transfer are far more likely to accept it passively if they believe they were victims of a general destruction that harmed everyone equally, rather than participants in a transfer that specifically moved their wealth into specific other hands. The frame of destruction is comforting to the losers precisely because it hides the fact that they were losers in a game that had winners. So the first and most important reframe is simply this: do not think of the coming period as one in which wealth might be destroyed. Think of it as one in which wealth will be transferred on a very large scale, and understand that the only real question, the question that actually determines your outcome, is which side of that transfer you will be on. And this reframe leads directly to the central claim I want to make, which is that the coming decade is very likely to be a period of unusually large wealth transfer, larger than the periods that preceded it, and that this is not because of any single dramatic event that can be predicted or feared, but because of the convergence of several distinct structural forces, each of which is on its own a powerful mechanism of transfer, all of which happen to be operating simultaneously and reinforcing one another, and the simultaneity is what makes the coming transfer unusually large. Let me be clear that I am not predicting a crash or a collapse or any specific catastrophic event, because I do not think anyone can predict such things with any reliability, and the people who claim to be able to have been consistently wrong in ways that have discredited the substance of their concerns. I am saying something more structural and more important than any prediction of an event. I am saying that there are forces already in motion, visible to anyone willing to look at them clearly, that are transferring wealth continuously and will continue to transfer it, and that the aggregate effect of these forces over the coming decade will be a redistribution of economic position on a scale that most people is comfortable in the assumption that their current position is stable, are not preparing for, because they are looking for a dramatic event to warn them, and the transfer is not a dramatic event. It is a gradual, continuous structural process, and its gradualness is exactly why the people on the losing side will not notice it until it is largely complete. The understanding of how to position yourself through a transition of this kind, of the principles that determine who ends up on the receiving side and who ends up on the supplying side, is worth developing deliberately and as a connected whole rather than in reactive fragments. And there is a body of work that lays out these principles carefully called the Naval Codex. It is not a prediction, and it is not a set of tactics. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who builds and preserves genuine wealth through transitions, of how leverage and specific knowledge and ownership interact to place a person on the receiving side of the transfers that transitions produce. If you are serious about not being on the supplying side of what is coming, engaging with those principles directly is more valuable than any specific forecast, because the principles hold across every particular transition, and the particulars can never be predicted precisely. Now let me examine the forces themselves, the specific mechanisms of transfer that are converging, because the abstract principle only becomes useful when you can see the concrete channels through which the wealth is actually moving. The first mechanism, and the one that is developing most rapidly and that most people are least prepared for, is the technological transfer, the redistribution of economic leverage that artificial intelligence is producing. And I want to be precise about how this works, because it is neither the optimistic story that artificial intelligence creates wealth for everyone, nor the pessimistic story that it simply destroys jobs. It is a transfer, and understanding it as a transfer is understanding it correctly. Artificial intelligence is redistributing economic leverage. It is dramatically amplifying the economic output of the people who possess genuine specific knowledge and who own the productive systems that the technology multiplies, while simultaneously compressing the economic position of the people whose income was derived from performing the kind of cognitive labor that the technology can now perform adequately. This is a transfer, and it is a large one, and it is accelerating. The value that once flowed to the person who could perform a given cognitive task competently is flowing instead to the person who owns the system that now performs that task, and to the person whose specific knowledge is amplified rather than replaced by that system. The person who sells commoditizable cognitive labor is on the supplying side of this transfer. The person who owns specific knowledge and the productive systems that amplify it is on the receiving side. And the transfer is happening now, continuously, in real time, and it will happen faster over the coming decade as the technology matures and its deployment widens, and the gap between the two sides, which is already widening, will become a chasm, because the same technology that compresses the position of the one amplifies the position of the other, and the divergence compounds. So what makes this transfer particularly consequential is that it falls on a category of people who have historically felt secure. The educated performers of skilled cognitive labor, the people who assumed that their training and their competence placed them permanently on the comfortable side of the economy. For most of history, the ability to perform skilled cognitive work was a reliable foundation of economic security because only human beings could perform it, and so it retained its value. The coming decade is the period in which that assumption breaks, in which the security of skilled cognitive labor erodes, because the labor is no longer scarce, and the wealth that flowed to that labor begins to flow instead to those who own the capability that replaced it. The person on the wrong side of this will not experience it as a sudden event. They will experience it as a gradual and puzzling erosion of their bargaining position, a slow decline in the real value of their labor, a creeping sense that their competence is worth less than it used to be, without ever quite locating the transfer that is occurring beneath the surface of their working life. The second mechanism of transfer is the monetary one, and it is the oldest and the most continuous, and it operates so quietly that most of its victims never perceive it at all. We live within a debt-based monetary system in which the supply of money expands over time and expands particularly rapidly in response to crises, of which there's always eventually another. This expansion transfers wealth continuously and silently, and it transfers it in a specific direction. When the money supply expands, the new money flows first into assets, into the things that owners own, bidding up their prices, while wages and cash savings lag and erode. The person who holds their wealth in wages and in cash watches the real purchasing power of both quietly decline, because the wages rose slower than the prices and the cash did not rise at all, while the person who holds assets watches the nominal value of their holdings rise more or less in step with the expansion. This is a transfer, a continuous flow of purchasing power away from the holders of wages and cash and toward the holders of assets and toward the debtors, including the largest debtor of all, whose real obligations shrink as the currency in which they are owed loses value. It is not a dramatic transfer in any single year. A few percent of erosion is barely perceptible month to month. But sustained across a decade and amplified by the scale of monetary expansion and the fiscal trajectory that is likely to require still more of it, it is an enormous transfer. And it falls, as it always falls, on the savers and the wage earners who are doing exactly what they were told was prudent, and it flows to the owners of assets who may be doing nothing at all except holding what they hold. The way capital actually moves during these monetary shifts, where it flows and why, and what happens to different kinds of assets when the monetary order itself begins to change, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the Dragon Pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how monetary transitions unfold across history, what they do to different asset positions, and how those who understood them early positioned their wealth to be on the receiving side of the transfer rather than the supplying side. If the mechanism I am describing concerns you, and for anyone holding their wealth primarily in wages and cash, it genuinely should, that is where the fuller historical picture lives, and understanding it is itself a step toward crossing from the side of the system that supplies the transfer to the side that receives it. The third mechanism is the deepest, and in a sense it underlies the other two, and it is the transfer that occurs continuously between those who own and those who merely rent their time, a transfer that is always operated but that the coming decade will sharpen dramatically. The fundamental structure of an economy is that the surplus produced by organized labor flows to the owners of the enterprises within which that labor is organized. The worker receives a wage, capped and stable and disconnected from the growth, and the owner receives the surplus, which compounds. This is a continuous transfer occurring in every enterprise every day, from those who rent their time to those who own the productive assets, and it is the oldest transfer of all. What the coming decade does is accelerate it, because the two forces I have already described, the technological and the monetary, both intensify the advantage of ownership over labor. The technology amplifies the owner and compresses the laborer. The monetary expansion enriches the asset holder and dilutes the wage earner. And the two together mean that the ancient transfer from labor to ownership, always present, is about to run faster than it has run in living memory. And the people who own compounding productive assets are about to pull away from the people who rent their time at a rate that will make the coming decade one of dramatic divergence between the two. And this brings me to the practical question, the question of what it actually means to be on the receiving side of these transfers, because it is not enough to understand the mechanisms in the abstract. And it is not even enough to know that one should own assets rather than rent one's time. The crucial thing is which assets, because the coming transfers will not treat all assets equally. And the person who owns the wrong kind of asset may find themselves on the supplying side of the transfer, even though they believed they were an owner. There is a crucial distinction between assets whose value is grounded in genuine productive capability, in the creation of real value for real people, and assets whose value is merely a financial claim on a strained system or a bet on a rising price with nothing real beneath it. The transfers I have described, the technological and the monetary and the ownership transfer, all flow toward genuine productive capability and away from mere financial claims. The equity in an enterprise that produces real value, the intellectual property that generates real returns from real usefulness, the productive asset grounded in genuine and ongoing demand, these are the things that receive the transfer because their value is grounded in the real productive activity that the transfers concentrate. The purely financial claim, the paper asset whose value depends entirely on the management of the strained system, the speculation dressed up as investment, these are far more likely to be on the supplying side because their value is not grounded in anything real and can be transferred away as easily as it was acquired. The work of distinguishing genuinely productive assets from merely financially engineered ones, and of building a position out of real productive capability and real institutional protection, rather than out of speculation or paper claims on a strained system, is worth doing systematically rather than reactively. And there's a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in things that produce genuine value in the world, the kind of wealth that ends up on the receiving side of a great transfer rather than the supplying side, rather than in the financial engineering that looks like wealth in favorable conditions and is transferred away in unfavorable ones. For anyone who is serious about being a recipient rather than a source of what the coming decade will move, that is the fuller treatment of the question. Now I want to turn to what I think is the most important part of all of this, which is not the mechanisms themselves, but the reason that most people, even when the mechanisms are explained to them clearly, will nonetheless remain on the supplying side of the transfer, because understanding why is the only thing that gives a person a real chance of doing otherwise. And the reason is not a lack of information, because the information is available, and it is not a lack of intelligence, because intelligent people are as likely as anyone to be on the losing side. The reason is that transfers of this kind are, by their nature, invisible to the people on the losing side until they are largely complete. And their invisibility is not accidental, but structural, a property of how these transfers actually operate. The first reason the transfer is invisible to its victims is that it is gradual. There is no single moment at which the wealth is taken, no dramatic event that announces the transfer and warns the loser to act. There is only a slow, continuous, almost imperceptible flow, a few % of monetary erosion a year, a gradual decline in the bargaining value of one's labor, a slow divergence between the trajectory of the owner and the renter. And the human mind is very poorly equipped to perceive gradual, continuous change. It is calibrated to notice sudden events, sharp discontinuities, dramatic reversals, and it is nearly blind to the slow, steady process that transfers a fortune over a decade in increments too small to register in any given month. The person on the losing side is not ignoring an obvious threat. They are failing to perceive a threat that is, by its nature, below the threshold of ordinary perception, and that reveals itself only in the aggregate, only when the decade is over and the position has shifted so far that it can no longer be denied. The second reason is that the transfer is denominated in a unit that hides it. The wage earner and the saver measure their wealth in the currency, and the currency is the very thing that is being diluted. And so from inside the reference frame of the currency, the erosion is invisible. The number in the account does not fall. The salary does not decline in nominal terms. Everything measured in the diluting currency appears stable, and the transfer is concealed by the very unit of measurement that the loser is using to check whether anything is wrong. To perceive the transfer, one must step outside the currency and measure in something else, in real purchasing power, in ownership of productive assets, in some unit that the transfer is not itself eroding. And most people never step outside the currency because the currency is the water they swim in, and so the transfer occurs beneath a surface that appears to the eye, measuring in the diluting unit, perfectly calm. And the third reason, the deepest one, is that acknowledging the transfer requires acknowledging that one is on the losing side of it. And this is psychologically very difficult because it requires abandoning the comfortable assumption that one's current position is secure, that the prudent path one has followed is actually prudent, that the wealth one believes one has is actually being preserved. It is far more comfortable to explain away the evidence of the transfer, to attribute the creeping sense of erosion to temporary conditions, to dismiss the people who describe the mechanisms as alarmists, than to accept that one is participating on the losing side in a transfer that is quietly moving one's wealth into other hands. The discomfort of that acknowledgement is one of the most reliable forces keeping people on the supplying side of the transfer, because the acknowledgement is the necessary first step toward acting, and the discomfort prevents the acknowledgement, and so prevents the action, and the transfer continues undisturbed. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see the structure clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest patterns in all of economic history, and it is not new. Every major transition transfers wealth. In every great disruption, wealth has moved from those positioned to lose it to those positioned to receive it. And the language of destruction has always concealed the transfer, and the people on the losing side have always failed to perceive it until it was complete, precisely because it was gradual and denominated in a unit that hid it and painful to acknowledge. This is not new. What is new is only the circumstance, the convergence in the coming decade of several powerful transfer mechanisms operating simultaneously, the technological and the monetary and the acceleration of the ancient transfer from labor to ownership, all reinforcing one another, all pointing in the same direction, and the aggregate is likely to be a transfer larger than the ones that came before. I am not telling you to be afraid, because fear is a poor guide and produces reactive rather than deliberate decisions. And I am not telling you that any specific catastrophic event is coming, because I do not believe anyone can know such things. I am telling you to see the transfer clearly, to understand that the coming period is not one in which wealth will be destroyed, but one in which it will change hands on a very large scale, and to understand that the only question that actually matters, the question that will determine your outcome, is which side of that transfer you will be on. And then, having seen it clearly, to begin quietly and patiently, and on whatever scale your circumstances allow, to cross from the supplying side to the receiving side, to move from renting your time to owning productive assets, from holding wages in cash to holding things grounded in genuine productive value, from selling commoditizable labor to building and owning the specific knowledge and the systems that the transfers concentrate. This is not done in a single dramatic act. It is done slowly, in the accumulation of many small choices to build ownership rather than to rent time, to hold real productive assets rather than paper claims, to position oneself deliberately and in advance on the receiving side of what is coming. And the transfer itself, invisible for so long to those on the losing side, will reveal itself, when it finally reveals itself, the way these things always do, slowly and then suddenly, at the moment when the decade of gradual movement has shifted the ground so far that it can no longer be denied, and the wealth that moved will be found, as it is always found after every great transition, in the hands of the few who saw the transfer clearly while it was still gradual, and quietly positioned themselves to receive it.